Okay, Happy New Year, everyone. Hopefully, you had a good time off. Uh, I'm still recovering from jet lag, so if I sound a little bit weird, sorry. But okay, so this course 209 AS is a special topics course, and the focus is on security and privacy issues in embedded systems, cyber physical systems, or Internet of Things. So that's kind of what this course is about. And I guess what I would like to sort of the takeaway from this course is really that the set of problems that arise in security and privacy that are distinctive relative to the kind of issues you face in general purpose computing. Okay, so of course security privacies are both issues in our normal computing, whether cloud services or your desktops, laptops as well, but there are a set of more distinctive aspects that occur in these other category of computing devices. So that's what I hope to take away. It's intended to be a course which is kind of a more seminarish in some flavor, in the sense that much of what is happening in this space is really kind of the topic of papers and all in current conferences. So it's not like textbook kind of material that we can cover. So every time I offer this course, there's basically, in the preceding 12 months, there is a whole new body of work. And so the intent is both, I try to in the lectures, but also in projects as well, we want to explore what's happening. I think we are still a few years away from sort of, if you may, some sort of unified principles behind these things getting established. So as usual, what I'll do is I'll spend the first 30 minutes, 35 minutes or so on going over some of the course logistics. This is my contact information, so you can basically, I'm in this building, explore. Many of you have taken my courses before, so you know where to find me. Oftentimes we'll meet in my lab, which is 1762, so southwest corner of this building on the first floor. So I guess the premise behind what I'm going to cover really is that if you think about these IoT, CPS, embedded systems, a lot of them are intended to enhance our safety. Sort of whether it's monitoring our health and helping with that, or our driving habits, or security of our homes and such. But they themselves have been a subject of both attack, and they themselves do unintentional things which sort of compromise our privacy. So in recent years, lots of items in the popular press have kind of indicated to that. So these kind of systems being hacked, or they themselves becoming enablers to attacking our normal systems. So for example, many of these systems, since they tend to be poorly managed, as we'll see one of the issues that they have. So while the standard servers and computers on the network of an enterprise may be hard to penetrate, but once you penetrate into, let's say, the computer controlling the HVAC system, then that can become a vector into spreading elsewhere. So there have been lots of attacks of that nature as well. And then there are other issues, which is since these systems do interact with the physical world, so being able to, so that raises this issue that you can attack them in ways that don't necessarily make sense for our standard laptops and all. So for example, if a computer if my laptop has a different notion of its location, at best it's an annoyance. But on the other hand, if your car has a different notion of its location, then the consequences can be catastrophic. These things also have to interact with humans, and yet they lack a lot of user interfaces that we normally expect have in devices. So keyboard, screens, and all, a lot of the time they are not even present. And then since they are in kind of more safety critical type applications, so what also happens is that oftentimes there are conflicts in terms of what should do. I'm sure you might have read these kind of articles about, like, if a autonomous car faces, it has to hit someone, and it's a young person, old person, who should it do it? A lot of these things sort of come into play as well. But the bigger point is that these become potential vectors. If the software in these systems get compromised somehow, then they could be used to cause damage. So when there's sort of two facets to this broad issue. One is making sure that the operation of these systems is secure, and the other is that it's privacy aware. Both of these are two facets of our trust in these systems. If either is compromised, then there are issues. So the former one, in effect, is really translates into affecting often the safety of these operations or safety of other systems, in the sense if these things get compromised, then other systems are at risk. And privacy, in part, is an issue out. There are kind of two kind of issues out here. One is, in these systems is often a lot of intellectual property. So as the manufacturers of these systems, particularly when you are deploying these things out in the wild, sort of say, so making sure that your intellectual property doesn't leak, that's the manufacturer's perspective. But the flip sided, our perspective as users of these systems, that information that these systems are capturing is handled properly, and moreover, they don't themselves capture information which we didn't want to. So since they're equipped with sensors and they capture all sort of moments of our life, so imagine a assistive medical device is intended for, let's say, some particular ailment, but it may be capturing all sort of it may be capturing information from which all sort of other inferences could be made as well. So to list what kind of issues come up. So firstly, a lot of these systems are remote and unattended, and that raises a set of challenges. So firstly, compromising their physical context, location being an example, can affect their functionality. It also opens the opportunity to exploit a lot of what are called as side channels. So by side channel in the security world, what it refers to is that when you're attacking a system, instead of breaking the crypto protocol or instead of stealing the password or kind of coming through your standard keyboard screen or network vectors, you basically exploit some sort of a physical effect of the system. So a very common example of this has been power side channels. So essentially, by monitoring the power consumption of a system, you can infer what the system is doing, because essentially operations within the system have different power signatures. Now, that's pretty hard for someone to do on my laptop, because they have to physically sort of get access to the laptop. But on the other hand, if a system is deployed out in the unattended, then these kind of side channels become easier to exploit. Distributing the crypto keys or changing them, any sort of management operation becomes hard. Attestation refers to can we trust that the software in these systems has not been compromised. So like, for example, if I have a Raspberry Pi or something based system deployed out there, what if someone reflashes the firmware? How could we know that we are dealing with a pristine system? Another issue is that these systems are often wirelessly networked. So that means that some of the standard remote exploitations are still applicable. So someone sitting in a different country being able to penetrate is equally valid to these systems. But in addition, you have issues like you can jam and spoof much more easily than kind of a wired network or a well-maintained network. Communication is often intermittent, so we can't assume that we have continual connection to some sort of a trusted source. So even things like time or access to secure databases and all is not necessarily always guaranteed. Limited resources, both in terms of computing and all, as well as in terms of user interfaces. And that results in that a lot of things that you could easily do on a more powerful computer are often not the case. So you need lighter weight implementations, lower power implementations, as well as ways of doing things like authentication and pairing and all, which don't require kind of keyboards and all. So for example, we are kind of often used to, we are pairing a Bluetooth device and kind of says, does this number show up on the screen of your phone? Well, that works because the phone has a screen. But what if you're trying to pair something which doesn't have these user interfaces? So how do we go around kind of doing that? The processors and kind of the underlying computing system architecture behind these often lack the security mechanisms that we are used to. So like, for example, the processors may not have separation of OS and applications. The operating systems may be simple. So a lot of those things that we take for granted are often not present, and that makes implementation harder, secure implementation harder, or in other words, malware can do a lot more damage much more easily in terms of exploiting vulnerabilities. Another issue that comes up in these systems is that there are just way too many. If I mean, there's probably 10 to 100x difference between the number of laptop and type class devices versus these tinier sensors and IoT type devices that are littered. I mean, even something like this room probably has tons of stuff which is just part of this infrastructure, ranging from motion sensors to the projector to smart lighting and things like that. There's a whole network that the UCLA facilities runs in our buildings with tons of sensors and all, and they are kind of firewalled away from our regular networks, but someone who penetrates them can have a lot of problems, fire alarms and things like that. So and they're often poorly managed. So kind of our organization is one, but imagine these kind of things in a home kind of a setting and all. And also the supply chain behind these systems is often pretty poor, in the sense that these systems are built and then often are with us for decades, because they may be part of a building, and also they may be coming from some unknown manufacturers. So unlike Apple or Google pushing security updates to our phones on a pretty regular basis, these things may not get updated that frequently at all. The supply chain often involves a company making a system on chip, then some sort of gray box manufacturer in some country making these things, selling it to a OEM who puts their stamp, and then you as a consumer deal with that OEM, or perhaps that OEM ships it to a service provider like your cable company, and then you are getting it. So you are several hops removed from the entity responsible for discovering and fixing the bugs, and that makes it pretty hard to distribute updates and all. Also, a lot of times these updates and all are at a pretty deep level in the system, at the firmware level and all, so it's not simply some app or OS getting patched that easily. As a result, these things have been very attractive. So this quantity and poor management has been they have been targets for botnets. Anyone knows what botnets refers to, or what bots refer to? Yeah. Yeah, you. Huh?
A bunch of computers that are controlled by a nefarious actor.
Right. So. Just want to start having someone talking other than me. Okay, so bots refer to a bot refers to someone, some remote entity takes over, injects a malware to your computer and takes control of it, unbeknownst to you. Okay, so it could be kind of pretty deep down. Botnet refers to is a whole cluster of these things, which then collectively can be tasked to do things in quantity. So what kind of things they can do? So like what kind of things where a botnet benefits? Huh? Denial of service, right? I mean, they can all, if you have tens of thousands of them, they can attack, they can bring down even a large company's server pretty easily, and yet the culprit is kind of behind them. So there have been some pretty well-covered attacks where the botnets were built using these kind of, I think in one case it was some webcam manufacturer from China which were compromised, and I think it was a Mirai attack. But there are plenty of other examples like that have emerged. And also, precisely these issues also make it difficult to manage, give them crypto keys, pair them, things like that. I mean, it's hard enough for ordinary people to manage their own sort of personal computers. Imagine in a home with tens of or hundreds of these devices, their management. I think very key is that these things are intrinsically designed to interact via sensors and actuators with their surroundings, both physical world as well as humans, and that leads to a whole bunch of issues. So firstly, when a sensor collects data, it's really collecting the raw data. It's not collecting a particular inference about you, right? I mean, I may have a sensor which is counting steps, but it's not really deep down, it's not really measuring steps. It's taking our acceleration and signatures, and from the same readings you can make a lot of other inferences as well, right? I mean, not simply how many steps, but perhaps also other kind of actions. When was I smoking, how much did I sleep, stuff like that. All sort of things could be done. So unintended leakage of information is one. Since they have actuators, so there is a possibility of physical damage, because if by compromising the system, then you can cause it to misbehave. So, like for example, you take over, I don't know, like the HVAC control of a building or control of a drone or things like that. You can easily imagine scenarios where then you can cause in turn damage to the physical world. More importantly, these if you think about like computer with a radio, radio is nothing but I mean, in a philosophical term, it's nothing but the sensor of the RF spectrum, right? And when we say communication, it's really that the other party, our Wi-Fi access point, let's say, they are a cooperative entity, and so they send us something with a predefined notion of things and all. So the packets come in, we agree upon the modulation and formats and stuff like that, and then we interpret them, and then the software changes the state. I can do the same thing, and then you can have non-cooperative senders who can inject malformed packets and cause unintended changes in the state of the software. Like for example, the content of the packet may be bogus or designed to exploit some fault and some error in my code. I can do the same thing through other sensors also. So I mean, whether it's an accelerometer or a light sensor and whatnot, eventually it's again taking some sort of a physical signal from the outside world, much like the RF, except and sometimes it may be cooperative. People do communicate using light or sound, but often, but in a strict sense, sensing is simply capturing these physical signals, analyzing them, and then using our internal software, and then causing some change in state. And by compromising these signals, you could affect the functionality. So that's one thing, which is I can inject false data into these systems to cause it to make incorrect estimation of the world state. Sometimes these physical signals can also be used to affect the functionality of the hardware itself. So, for example, by injecting electromagnetic noise, you can affect the performance of the analog circuits, for example, and which can in turn result in a fault. So in this case, we are injecting fault via the hardware. So so with this perspective, that a sensor is really a way of collecting these devices can essentially receive physical signals. I can both manipulate the change state of the software, as well as we can potentially affect the state of the hardware. Increasingly, these systems, like almost anything in engineering nowadays, are using data-driven algorithms, masses of data, kind of train neural nets and all, to do it. But one of the challenge is that these algorithms now, which we are now using to interpret the sensor data or to control things are kind of more hard to understand, kind of black boxish. Hundreds of millions of parameters. So if someone compromises them at some stage, it's very hard for us to figure out what's happening. And moreover, it turns out that they're often very brittle. So there are a variety of concerns which have emerged around compromising sort of this analytics aspect of these systems, whether it's on the device or whether it's out in the cloud. But very broadly, two of them. One is that I can fool them. I can manipulate the input, which we are giving ever so slightly, and that fools these devices. So that's called poisoning the input. And the other is that these models that are used by these machine learning models or control models that these systems use are often coming from other vendors, right? I mean, just like we buy software, likewise we get training data and train the models, but the training data may be coming from third parties, or we may even be buying models or downloading models from elsewhere. And if they are compromised, then it's kind of the equivalent of a malware being injected in your software. So that raises a whole bunch of issues that, as you might imagine. And then finally, these things run on relatively specialized software and hardware platforms. So put another way, there is immense fragmentation in this industry, while kind of for general purpose computers, there's pretty much Intel, AMD, kind of a few main players. But when it comes to these devices, there are hundreds of vendors, many different processor families, tons of different operating systems. So I guess a positive way of looking at it is that it gives you resilience via diversity. If you have many different things, so a bug can bring down only some fraction of them. But on the other hand, it also makes it harder to keep track of the vulnerabilities that do exist. Okay, security researchers tend to focus more on things which are kind of out there in a bigger quantity. So just a mindshare issue that emerges. So what we'll cover in this course really is, we'll start with, that's going to be kind of next lecture later this week, on some case studies on kind of attacks and all that have happened, and kind of with the hope of bringing out what kind of issues that emerge. And since the application spaces are pretty diverse, so I'm just going to pick 3 of them: vehicular, medical, and industrial. But there are many other examples that kind of exist. Then I'm going to spend some time just to go over some basics of security. So if you have done a good undergrad course on security, that material would be old hat, but I do want to bring, a lot of you are coming from non-CS background, so I just want to bring everyone up to speed on what does it mean. One thing that those of you who are coming from EE background, securing a system and all requires a very different mindset of thinking. So it's an attack is not like noise, like we are used to thinking in terms of communication systems where noise gets injected and all, and but the thing is, in that case, the generator of the noise is not engaged in a game with you of some sort. It's the noise is whatever its characteristic is, Gaussian noise, whatnot. But in a security, you're dealing with an adversary who's out to exploit your weakness. So it's more of a game in that sense, that you have to assume kind of the worst case. So so oftentimes I see kind of people bring the noise mindset to security, and in some cases that's fine, but it's very important to have a good sense of what the model of the attacker is, what the attacker knows, what it's capable of doing is, what its intent is, how it will go around doing it. So we'll have some discussion around that. Then we're going to switch over to the side channel attacks, or specifically hardware side channel attacks. So there are 2 types of side channel attacks that exist. There are side channel attacks which are architectural attacks. That is, it turns out in recent years people have shown that within our processors, there are lots of ways you can infer or even affect the functionality of a program. So just to cite a couple, it turns out that DRAMs, right, our computers rely on them. You read and write to a location, and the model is I can write to an address or read from an address, right? But it turns out that the way DRAM circuits are, remember, deep down they're basically capacitances, and when you write, they charge, discharge. It turns out that when you read or write to one particular column, then one particular row, then the neighboring row is also affected. Okay, so there are attacks such as row hammering attack, where essentially I'm writing to an area of memory which is I'm privileged to write. It's just that on the neighboring row is residing data from some other process or even the operating system whom I am not privileged to affect. But by hammering, by repeatedly writing to my own memory, I can affect the state, the data structures of that other process. And likewise, the other way around, which is I can peek into the content of that. So that's some more recent work, paper actually at an upcoming conference, which kind of shows that. So that's an example. Another one which over the past 2-3 years have emerged are attacks called cache timing attacks. So the idea is cache is something which different processes on a processor share. And so my data, my processor's data, and other processor's data may be using the same region of the cache, same row of the cache. And so I can, by timing how much my accesses to the cache is taking, I can make some inferences about what the content of the data of the other process was. So it turns out lots of such problems lurk in our processors, and they've been asserted. But the kind of side channels that I'm particularly sort of going to focus on are things which are measured externally to these things. Okay, so essentially either sensing side channels or power related or timing. So someone who's able to examine your system from outside. So it's not the internal architectural state, but from outside, what can they do about it? Then we're going to go into secure sensing, and in particular focus on secure locationing as a major example. So in recent years, it turns out by affecting the ability to measure location and distance, by compromising that, lots of systems have been hacked. There have been incidences of cars being stolen because these keys that we have, which when you press the button, they kind of measure, they rely on measuring the distance, okay, and they rely on measuring the distance hopefully very precisely, but they didn't. So there were all sort of attacks that have emerged where expensive cars have been stolen and all, but again, things have sort of begun to change as better technologies are now being adopted. But I'm going to describe what happens there, and similar kind of issues with garage door openers and a whole bunch of other systems where the ability to measure time or location, if it gets compromised, has sort of interesting consequences. Then we are going to look into this topic that I described, which is compromising the analytics and the control algorithms that go into these systems. So AI and ML systems, particularly kind of things like neural nets operating in an adversarial setting, as well as the privacy implications. So just to give you an example, oftentimes one of the ways that these systems operate is we train a model on training data, then we deploy the model, and with that model is then works on some test data to make some inferences. But so we are not sharing the training data with the end customer, end user, but we are sharing the model. But what if from the model I can extract some information about the training data? So that would leak information, because a training data set could be a medical data set or could be images, and also so that's an example of a privacy leakage that can occur. So we're going to spend some time on that. These are also topics where you might would be I think all these sort of last 4 are good places to think about potential projects as well. Class registration issues. I think I sent out mails to everyone who was on the waiting list about PT numbers. Usually there's a pretty sharp fall off in the number of students. I think next lecture I'll see fewer, and by the end of next week it will probably be less than half. So we'll see how it goes. But I gave everyone a slot, so if you wish to be in the class, you can be. But if you do decide to discontinue with the course, my one request, drop out officially so that I'm not left wondering what the class size is, because it does affect course planning and all. So it just takes a few moments, just officially drop out instead of just stop attending. Okay, so I think my animations are screwed up. Okay, so grading course components. So half the course is really course project, and I would recommend doing it in teams, partly because security and privacy are kind of newer topics, so I expect only very few people to have prior background in it. So so I will generally not approve individual projects, but that's not a hard and fast rule. I'm going to describe more on how we'll sort of go around on the project side, but that's half the course weight. And then we'll have essentially sort of three pieces of work. Okay, assignments, which is basically going to involve some web research, some programming, depending upon what the class size turns out to be. So some of these things are going to remain a little bit fluid until the class size settles. In particular, hoping this time to introduce an assignment where you get to do hands-on stuff on some of those attacks that I kind of described. Then there is a paper presentation component. So essentially everyone will have to present a paper. Sometimes it would be a team handling a set of papers, or a team of K individuals handling K papers. The time per paper, if the class size remains around what it is right now, then it would be much shorter, but I'm hoping that the class size trails off so that we can have a more meaningful 15-20 minutes per paper, because I do want to not exceed around 8 to 9 hours during the quarter for the paper presentations and associated Q&A. So we'll see how it goes. Again, 2 years ago when I had offered this course, there were like 30 students, and last year when I offered this course, there were 10 students. So I don't have a good sense of where the number will be this quarter. And paper summaries. So again, to avoid, so the idea is that you have to write 4-slide paper summaries with a particular structure, but I don't want everyone to have to do it for, if the class size remains like this, 30 plus papers. So basically the idea is you'll do at most 12. So if the class size falls below 12, then there will be less than 12, but if the class size is above 12, then you'll be maxed out at 12. But I will assign the papers to you. Okay, so I want summaries to be distributed across the papers. Okay, so anyway, we are going to start on this paper presentation business and all from week 3, just to figure out where the class size settles, but I'm going to begin to announce the paper assignments before that. Okay, you can read these slides on your own. They're on Piazza, so I'm not going to go in depth on some of these logistical issues, but really want to go after the, let's see, is there any point? Yeah, okay. So project timeline. So one challenge I've faced in whenever I have these project type courses is that students wait until the day of project proposal being due to even start thinking about the project proposal. So this time around, I'm introducing an additional deadline, which is you are required to meet me once in a team manner, either in person or via Zoom, by Thursday, January 16th. So this is a way to force you prior to the actual deadline to come and meet me. Okay, so there will be credit towards this action. Okay, if you don't, then you are immediately hurting your grade in the course. This will also hopefully force you to think whether you want to be in the course or not. Tuesday 21st is the initial sort of finalize a project topic, team finalized, and you have to fill out a web form where you'll give me a URL to a GitHub page website where all you can have at that point is the abstract and the team member information and the associated repo. And then by 28th, you have to populate that with a more detailed proposal, timeline. You should have done some investigation into prior papers and all, and kind of be able to describe sort of what exists in your space. Then next month, we are going to have a in-class status presentation, and again, I'm expecting that the class size will fall off sufficiently that I can have around 7 minutes, maybe it will probably not be more than 10 minutes. Again, the precise number will be closer to that date, but you'll basically make each project team will make a midterm status presentation in class. So one of the lectures is for that, where you have to present any, besides what the project objectives and all are, any preliminary design results, code, etc. And again, your website, which is essentially kind of going to be your final project report, should reflect that. Then it turns out that due to some bureaucratic snafu, they did not give this course a final exam slot. It basically says discuss with the professor on how the evaluation will be done. So what I was actually hoping was to have used the final exam slot to have everyone present their project one go with short presentations, but that's not going to happen. So therefore, what I'll do is on Monday through Thursday of the finals week, I'm going to have a whole bunch of slots, and you are going to have to make a 20-minute project presentation plus demos. So use slides. If a demo makes sense, do a demo. In some, since you will have other final exams and all, you can hopefully find some that sort of work for you. If it turns out that absolutely no slot works for some individuals, then we can do something late night or Zoom or whatever. We'll just figure it out. I'm hoping that we'll have maybe around, again, for a class, usually sort of n over 2 projects for a class size of n works well. So I'm hoping no more than 15-ish projects or so. Then on the Friday of that week is by which time you should finalize the project website, include everything there. That's basically your report. So it should be organized in different sections that are typical of project report or a technical paper. So that's how we'll work. And within this, this is a further decomposition of how the score 50%, which is the project score, how the different components of that will get mapped. Okay, you can again read these things. One, as you go around looking for project ideas and all, this is machine learning AI, of course, is a super hot area of computing, but the next hot area of computing is basically security. So if you look in terms of where the most buzzwords or attendance and all are, these are the two. So there are tons of conferences and all, okay. The first four that I have listed are usually considered to be the tier 1 conferences in this space, but they are not focused on embedded CPS IoT security. They have big components just because of the importance of these systems, but they are more general conferences. Then oftentimes at these places there are workshops which are more focused on IoT or CPS and all. So if you go to these like websites, so for example, the number 3 IEEE Symposium on Security and Privacy is often referred to as Oakland SNP because it always takes place in Oakland. It takes place in April or May time frame, so the next one is upcoming, but the papers and all are already out, or you can look at the last year ones, but they have many workshops, and one of the workshops there is called Safe Things, which is really about safe Internet of Things. So just exploring a bit around and all, whether to look for project ideas or look, and I'm going to suggest at least some general directions of project topics, as well as when you're hunting for prior work. There are some conferences which are specifically focused on IoT, CPS, mobile computing, and they often tend to have security and privacy papers. So that's the other place to find things. So again, I've listed some of them out here. Okay, another strategy to look for related work and all is the key research groups. So I've kind of listed some of the major research groups who are working in this space. Some of their papers we are going to cover just either their material is part of my lectures or as part of the paper presentations. I've also listed some resources. There's tons of software and hardware and hack penetration resources and all that are kind of available for doing interesting projects. So I've again listed some of them. Course online, CCLE, I've basically put I find CCLE kind of rather clunky in terms of organizing course material, and also I put all the course resources publicly accessible on Piazza. So both the announcements and the class resources, lecture slides, and I'm recording my audio and kind of what's on the screen. So links to all of those are on Piazza but publicly accessible. So on CCLE, I've just put a link to Piazza. If Piazza also has the online discussions. I noticed CCLE has this thing called Questionly. Anyone use that? No one. Okay. So from my, I guess the issue out here is there's some of these apps which are UCLA sanctioned and the others are not. Questionly appears to be UCLA sanctioned. It seems decent, but still clunky relative to Piazza. So I'm kind of sticking to Piazza, but hopefully it will mature in future years. So anyway, you don't need to have a Piazza account if you just want to access the course material, but if you all the major announcements will be publicly accessible in the course material. But if you want to engage in discussion with others, then signing up on Piazza would be useful. Grading is through the submission of material and all is going to be through Gradescope, which is UCLA sanctioned now. So so that's what we'll be using. Lecture videos. So I just want to clarify that one, that I do it on my own using software I purchased. So along with it comes the issue that I cannot guarantee its availability. Sometimes there are technical snafus, so don't plan to not attend a lecture and then say, hey, where is the video? So it's entirely best effort basis. I think last quarter, those of you there, I did have one snafu where we failed to record a big part of one lecture. So it happens. So again, don't hold me to it. And usually there are 2-3 day delay before I find time to convert and upload. So just wanted to clarify that. But otherwise, again, the lectures are going to be all publicly accessible there. No textbook, although I do write, there's one particular book which is out there available free on UCLA library as in free electronic copy, so you don't need to purchase it. It has kind of a good thing, except it's like 3 or 4 years old, so it's essentially, other than the high level view, is quite a bit obsolete. Cheating, plagiarism, you can read on these things. Okay, final logistical issue. There are 3 dates on which the lecture is impacted due to my travel. So I'll handle it through some combination of these things and yet to be announced. Some substitute or guest lecture or a pre-recorded lecture, or we may arrange for a makeup lecture depending on how it goes. Okay, so that's where we are. Any questions about any logistical aspect? Okay, so one final bit of logistics is just for me to get a sense of who's here. If you could go to the simple web form and it just asks for your name and email and the last few digits of your UID, that's so that students who have common last names I can distinguish. This is just for me to get a sense of who's actually here in the class. The registrar website shows 36 individuals, so anyone here who is not on wait list and not enrolled? What are your plans? To enroll. Okay. Oh, one other thing I forgot to explicitly state, although even though it was on the first slide, I am planning to have the office hours on Tuesdays 12 to 1 and Fridays 12 to 1. But if they don't work for you, any of you for any particular reason, feel free to send me a note on Piazza and we can do a Zoom session. That usually works very well because it gives me flexibility to do it early morning, evenings, weekends, whatnot. So Tuesday and Friday 12 to 1 in my office. But I will hold additional office hours or additional availability this week and early part of next week so that you can actually come and meet me about your projects, okay? So again, remember you do have to form the teams and come and meet me. Unless you have a strong sense of a priori sense of some project idea or something, in most cases I suspect you will need help. Another thing you can do is, in lieu of me, so my postdoc Luis Garcia, whose again information I had on the first slide, is kind of acting as a let's say assisting instructor, if you may. Main thing is that he himself is going to be a faculty in a few months, so I'm trying to give him some experience. But he's the other resource you have. His PhD was in security, so he has lots of ideas and all that he can kind of help you with. If you have some of your own research which you think may benefit from a security angle or already has a security privacy angle, then feel free to come and discuss with me. But again, generally I would really like people to have a team project. So usually in those kind of projects where it's related to your own research, maybe those are ones where individual projects may be acceptable. Okay, everyone taken this URL? Okay, so if no other question, let's move to the main lecture for today. So essentially here it's kind of a quick sort of run through a variety of different issues, some of which I very briefly mentioned early on security and privacy for IoT and CPS. So a lot of our computing systems are in this category of they are interacting with sort of cyber physical world and humans. Humans are, so often people call it human cyber physical. So examples are your autonomous vehicles and various kind of control systems and sensors which monitor us, and also larger scale things. I mean, traffic systems and airplanes and things like that and all. And a lot of them have suffered from these issues which relate to security and privacy. I've sort of given some examples out there. So for example, sometimes the information these systems rely on gets compromised. So for example, GPS error. A lot of these systems use GPS for their timing or location, and GPS can be spoofed, and sometimes mismanagement causes errors, and that has resulted in sort of issues, kind of these systems being impacted. Lots of examples where apparently utilities have been attacked to cause outages. Some cases, so water plants and electric utilities and such. There are hacks in cars, which have been very well advertised. Attacks on the sensors in cars. So a lot of the driver assist devices and semi-autonomy device sensors rely on things like lidars and radars and cameras and all, and they getting fooled increasingly. So sometimes it's a sensor which is fooled, and sometimes it's the machine learning algorithm behind the sensor which is fooled. Net effect is kind of really the same. Sometimes these systems are being attacked by more traditional means, that is because they are networked but they are weakly protected. So you penetrate it over the network, take over the system, and then cause chaos. So like taking over the control system for, let's say, light rail system in a city, then you can kind of begin to mess with the signaling and speed and stuff like that and all. Using these devices to spread malware, so this kind of goes with this whole issue of that they themselves are poorly maintained and all. So in short, sort of, it's not some in theory kind of situation at this point. These kind of attacks are happening a lot, and in fact there's a search engine called Shodan, Shodan, whose sole purpose is you can search for IoT devices which are directly on the internet and what kind of weaknesses and all they have, so that you can go out and mount attacks on them. So lots of cool stuff out there if you want to be naughty, I guess. So just to give you an example, imagine a mobile health system, okay? Sort of humans with sensors of different types, some of instruments at home they use or things that they wear, like your Fitbits and such. And all of this data aggregates to some sort of data broker. There are companies which provide the software to collect this data and put it into your electronic health record. There are people conducting health research studies. There is currently a big study going on in the US called All of Us, and it's basically has recruited millions of individuals to collect their data. And the thesis behind from the medical science side is that in our sensory data are often indicators of health issues that are in early stages. So this is kind of like a digital variant of standard clinical tests and all. So kind of our data cloud can substitute for or at least can complement our standard, more sporadic medical tests. So in any case, these things get aggregated, collected, and then finally they are disseminated to various types of interested parties: your doctor, medical researchers, you yourself. That whole notion of being able to introspect and then modify our own behavior. Policy making entities like CDC might be interested in knowing how sort of something is spreading. So anytime there is a public health issue, there are both kind of the direct sensory data as well as the searches and all that we make. Like for example, in the last few days, there is this stuff about that in China. I think there is some particular form of pneumonia which has begun to spread, and they're kind of a bit clueless as to what the cause is. So or just more generally, when flu spreads and all, so those kind of things can sort of play a role. So what challenge arises in a system like this is, firstly, it's at the edges of the system there are lots of devices which are the sources of data, and they're networked, and yet they're kind of self-managed, general purpose, potentially kind of lots of issues in terms of data can be spoofed, and data can be sniffed. Another aspect is that the sensor data are pretty multidimensional and rich. So if I were to show you a data record with your address and social security number and all, your sort of reaction to what the privacy implications are. Kind of most of us will understand that. On the other hand, if we show you waveforms of your inertial sensor and all, like for most people, I don't know whether it's actually violating any aspect of my privacy or not, right? So so while these data are being continuously collected, and yet they're kind of hard to understand. Often these things are collected through so like we wear these sensors and all, but then they get aggregated through our either some sort of a home gateway or more typically our smartphones, and on these phones a variety of different apps, and they can have unauthorized, not all apps are made sort of equal or are equally trustworthy. The one challenge has been the use of third-party libraries. A lot of free apps that we download, the reason they are free is because they serve ads, and the way they serve ads is they link to third-party libraries. So when you give an app permission to take some particular sensor data, you're actually also giving that library permission to access that data. And now imagine this library is in tons of different applications. So even though you may give one app with that library access to sensor 1 and another app with the same library access to sensor 2, all of this thing gets combined and they have a complete picture on it. So there are very successful startups and businesses around this whole notion of developing a fingerprint for you. Right now their intentions are plain and simple. They want to track and be able to push ads at you and services at you, but that information is also telling them a lot more about you, which can be monetized potentially, or maybe is getting monetized. Okay, I think another thing that has happened is that I guess in the past a lot of this information, while there, was often not very easily exploitable. But one thing that has happened in recent years is that tools for doing data analytics, machine learning tools, are kind of have gotten pretty democratized, right? I mean, every student in engineering, in CS and ECE now probably takes an ML course, is capable of constructing pipelines to extract information and all. So that has changed. And also the technology is changing pretty rapidly and it's pretty complex. Okay, so all of these things conspire to sort of lead to a whole bunch of places where essentially you can have the trust in the system getting compromised. I've kind of highlighted some of them, but the main point is everywhere, really, right? I mean, I can tamper with the sensor. So I, as the person wearing the sensor, these sensors are being used, for example, well, some examples, right? One is some places they run competitions on how healthy your lifestyle is and they give you some awards and all. I think Singapore runs this thing as a nation, for example. Another one is where insurance companies are switching to a model where based upon your sensor data, they price you, whether it's for driving or for health or things like that. These are all cases where you have a motivation to tamper. So for example, I want to win that competition in Singapore. What if I just loan my Fitbit to my relative who likes to run a lot, for example, right? I mean, there are many different ways you can kind of tamper with this, tamper with the data. Spoofing is a closely related thing. Malware, spyware kind of entering into this thing. We could also jam these systems at critical instance. The servers and all getting hacked. Unauthorized access and unauthorized inferences. I may get the data from you under one pretense, like I would say, okay, like my, let's say, I don't know, UCLA Medical may get access to the inertial sensor data from your Fitbit, but for supposedly one purpose, but then they can harvest it for all sort of other information about your lifestyle and health and whatnot. So all these kind of issues that exist. Same kind of stuff happens in other domains. Like another area which has raised a lot of concern are these building automation systems or building management systems. So while it has penetrated less in homes, but enterprise buildings, particularly in, let's say, the more well-off countries, have pretty sophisticated sensors and management systems around them, controlling lighting and HVAC and security systems and whatnot and all. And lots and lots of examples, as well as potential attack scenarios that people have discussed. So these are some of the newsworthy items, but there's a pretty interesting paper from a few years ago called Alice's Adventures in Smart Building Landscape, which kind of hypothesizes various kind of scenarios. Like some of them may sound far-fetched, but imagine so firstly, these BMSs are made by a few companies. Okay, so if you find vulnerability in one BMS system, you're probably finding therefore vulnerability in many buildings. And now if you, let's imagine to play out one of the scenarios listed out here, we can mount an attack on a particular type of BMS, and therefore a large number of buildings in an area. We cause the energy consumption to increase, energy price to spike, and we play the energy market. Okay, so there are financial inducements that exist. And if it sounds far-fetched, a decade or so ago, there used to be a company called Enron here in the US, which actively manipulated the energy spot prices to make money in that process. So incentives exist. Then blackmail and all, right? Being able to lock someone into the into their home or elevator and whatnot. This is the counterpart of ransomware, which is happening with cities quite a bit. So lots and lots of examples like that. Closely related one are smart grids, so utility and smart water systems, and also being able to penetrate the utility and then holding entire cities to ransom for or causing problems there. So there have been some examples like that, not in the US. I think there was, if memory serves me right, there is one which was cited in Brazil of this nature. Just recently I read that some stock market issue in London is now being attributed to a potential attack. So there are these kinds of examples. Transportation systems have been another place where lots and lots of attacks or suspected attacks, including essentially in some cases these systems are relatively poorly protected. So there might be a website interface to some system. Let's say, for example, the computer which is providing you a ticketing interface or to check the status of where the bus or the train is. If that web app has some vulnerability, then that can let a normal user into the system, and then from there they can roam rest of the system in the network and potentially then control aspects in there. So an example some years ago, I forget which company it was, Target or Ross or something like that, where they had hacked into the HVAC control system, from which then they had gotten into the financial systems and stolen the credit card numbers and whatnot. So those are examples. One area where researchers in recent times have done a lot of poking into is these cars, which have variety of different sensors, and being able to show that how they can be fooled relatively easily. So cars with lidars, how if we can fool them into thinking something is there when it's not, or vice versa, that pedestrian is there but is actually made invisible to the car. So by fooling the sensors, we kind of compromise its sense of perception. So all these different sensors, GPS, ultrasound, cameras, lidars, radars, they all have been hacked or can be hacked. There's the Chinese company Tencent, for example, has in recent year or so published or shown several examples where they've systematically attacked systems in Tesla, including some of them are relatively benign. So like, for example, potentially benign. So for example, in Tesla now, the rain wiper. So normally automatically control wiping action is done using a rain sensor, which is basically a water sensor on the windshield, and that's how the wiper on off and speed is controlled. Except in case of Tesla, they actually use the camera to detect it is raining, so there's no rain sensor, but they use the camera with a neural net behind it and all. So as you can imagine, then those attacks which are image based, so Tencent shows that by basically projecting sort of a false image into the camera, you can kind of manipulate the radar, and at least that some of these actions happening just at the wrong time can cause issues. Okay, so sort of stepping back a bit, that these systems can be hacked and attacked and all is sort of a given. So what does it mean, and how should we go around thinking? So in the traditional information system security, there you can decompose your what you desire into a bunch of different kind of goals, and then potentially mechanisms around it. So one issue is availability of the system. If these systems provide certain service to us, and we want to make sure that the attacker is not able to prevent our usage of that system, right? Whether it's a sensor which is supposed to monitor my health, or something in a car, or a traffic light control system, whatnot. And methods to achieve it. So one is purely hardening the system. Making it harder to penetrate, making sure that you're using the best in class technologies and all. Having redundancy is another one, which is not rely on a single point of failure, having a layered system and a diverse system. And then finally, since sort of humans are a critical component of many of these systems, making sure that you vet them. Another aspect is authentication. So can we make sure that the person person who's sort of trying to use the system is really who he or she claims to be? So for example, systems like Amazon Echo and all now attempt to distinguish between different users based upon their voice imprint, right? So kind of it attempts to identify whether it's me or my wife or one of my other family members. But this problem is a lot harder in systems which deal with many different users. So while in our traditional laptops and all, authentication is password based or biometric based. Those are kind of the two common ones, at least we find them commonly. And then we have and that's how we present some credentials. This authentication problem becomes a lot harder in IoT devices because you just lack the user interfaces. And then there is also another issue, which is what's the real world identity behind this thing. And this is where our society at large now relies on this public key infrastructure with digital signatures, which are signed by sort of other companies and all, which kind of get used. A third goal is that of confidentiality. We want to keep secrets from leaking, and there is sort of two versions of it. One is I don't want to look at my file, and the other is I don't want you to make inferences which I didn't want you to make, even though I want to share other things about the data. So kind of it's a richer space, and cryptography plays a huge role out here. We can encrypt the data and protect the keys and kind of prevent others from looking at it. But it doesn't always doesn't work in all sort of scenarios. So this is where we also rely on physical isolation. We keep the systems in a physically secure place and only give access to those who we should. Then these systems are not connected to the network, and so and so forth. A term which is used for these physically isolated systems, anyone knows about it? What do we call these systems which have never been on a network, just physically isolated? Air-gapped, yeah. So air-gapped systems basically are just isolated, but it turns out that even air-gapped systems are being attacked by, so while they are air-gapped in the sense of the network, but they are not necessarily air-gapped in the sense of other physical side channels, and people do exploit those. Integrity of the system is another goal, which is we want to make sure that the adversary is unable to modify the functionality of the system, because by modifying that functionality, in turn, it can do all sort of nefarious things like extract information or take unadvised actions. So what it boils down to is there is integrity at manufacturing time, which is, as I am sourcing hardware and software components, I want to make sure what I am getting is really what I intended. So the my physical instance of something meets what my specification were. So a couple of years ago, there was this brouhaha over that how some Chinese company apparently was putting a tiny chip on server boards, and there was apparently sort of a lot of controversy around that. But then there is also sort of things like jailbreaking and rooting, jailbreaking your phone, where you essentially are then able to install software which as a result results in your device no longer be trusted for things like financial transactions or digital right management. So what do companies do? Well, there is this notion of secure enclaves or trusted processing modules, which are ways in which the platform vendor is able to ensure that a system will boot only if the operating system has not been, its integrity has not been compromised. So like, for example, your iPhone or Android phones, they all have these kind of chips which validate the integrity of the software. So you validate the integrity of, there is a lowest level software which is burnt into the chip, and then everything above that is validated. So the next layer of software will only run if it passes the validation checks, and those are cryptographically protected by Apple's keys in case of iPhone, for example. So there's this whole hierarchy of trust which sort of gets built, for example. We also want to exercise control over who can do what. So regulate the use of the system, which user is allowed to control the HVAC, which is allowed to open the lock, stuff like that. So that whole access control becomes issue, and there are a variety of methods which are used for that. And after doing all of this, things will still go wrong. So a very key component in these systems, tend to be, is the notion of auditing and forensics, which is, if something bad did go on, then being able to trace back what happened, when did it happen, who was the guilty party, and so on and so forth. So this is where things like log files, keeping track of information about every information, all those kind of things come in. And the final goal is that of non-repudiation, which is basically if someone does take part in an action, they should not be able to deny being taking part in that action. So if your computer sent out a message, you should not be able to do something which prevents that fact to be known. So again, crypto tends to kind of help out there. So, so variety of different goals, and as you read papers and all, it's good to keep in mind what problem are they solving. Okay, these are they all go under this umbrella of security related goals and security and sort of privacy related goals. One thing I would also say is that privacy is a broader problem than security, because I can easily define each one of these, what we mean. Privacy in a way is a societal issue in part also, right? What we deem private today is not something we'll necessarily consider private at a later point in time, because it changes with social norms. In fact, even at any given point in time, different societies view privacy very differently. I mean, I visited India over the Christmas break, and the kind of questions people take for granted about each other in this country, I mean, it would just not be acceptable. So I guess you could say people are more nosy, but it's a more crowded country, and also maintaining private space is a lot harder. And then a lot of them also really how societies evolve, how laws evolve. So just bear that in mind, that privacy really also has this additional component also. So some of the terminology that one has to keep in mind: vulnerability refers to some sort of a weakness that exists in your system design. It's potentially exploitable. It could be in hardware, it could be in the software implementation, it could be in the algorithms. So its source could be any, but it exists and can be exploited. Threat refers to event which has a potential to exploit this vulnerability and thereby affect some aspects of its operation. An attack is an actual attempt to then exploit a vulnerability to do something. So you have both passive attacks where you kind of just data the system, active attack where the adversary takes a more active role. Adversary is an entity who is engaged, and a variety of terms used to hackers and crackers and whatnot. And then finally, countermeasures or mitigations are things that you do to prevent these things from happening, or if they do happen, then being able to sort of recover back. And many times, with some of these, in some cases, the countermeasure may simply boil down to paying up the money. I mean, we have seen some companies and cities being held hostage, and the only way they got out is to actually pay the money in bitcoins, usually, so that they're untraceable to go out. But again, this terminology, just keeping in mind and being consistent is useful. Okay, so now back to our goal. So, so one type of attacks to concern about is those that are bridging the cyberspace in the physical space. So intrinsic in these CPS systems or IoT systems is because they're not just software only, they're not just dealing with bits on your hard drive kind of things, but they're actually affecting and measuring the state of the physical world. So what we are seeing is attacks which sort of previously there used to be cyber attack, they intend to mess with the data, and then there used to be physical attacks, you can hammer something and whatnot. But we are seeing these attacks which are kind of bridging these spaces. So for example, being able to attack the software to then cause some physical damage. So back in the early 2000s, Vice President Cheney had sort of some assistive heart system attached, permanently attached, and there was a lot of concerns about, because these are wirelessly operated, then some nearby adversary being able to manipulate that. I later on saw that also in as part of a TV theme of a TV episode as well. This is these are other examples where sort of compromising in the cyberspace can then lead to all sort of issues. So for example, you hear these things where a hacker gets control over a baby cam and then causes issues, and or taking control over a traffic light system. These are all kind of examples. So what we are seeing are these examples where kind of the boundary between cyber and physical is getting blurred. Another thing which has emerged is, which I don't have a slide on, is the analog attacks. Okay, so what I mean by that is that since these sensors collect analog data from the outside world, so they are measuring light or sound or whatnot. So you also have another vector of attack where you manipulate those waveforms. So by injecting an analog signal into the system, you can affect its state. So for example, there is a Professor Kevin Fu at University of Michigan, and he has shown many examples that by injecting analog signals of different forms into these systems, shining a laser. So this particular recent paper of his where he remotely, so imagine, let's say I have a Amazon Echo or Google Assistant type device in my home, except it's near a window, and my neighbor from across shines a laser onto this thing and is able to feed a command into that device. Okay, and the effect that he exploits is that the microphones in these systems have some thermal characteristics. So the laser shining on it causes some thermal effects, and which they modulate the laser in a particular manner so that this thing essentially receives a sound signal, even though there's no real sound, which is commanding it to do something. Okay, so analog vector becomes kind of a other examples. I mean, I guess good old examples are home security systems often rely on magnetic sensing to detect whether the door is open or closed, right? You open the door, the magnetic link is broken. So if you don't deploy these systems carefully, the burglars often would have a magnet there and then open the door so that the sensor continues to think the door is closed even though it has now opened. So you need to do it carefully, but analog vector and then fooling the software state is very common. So what that leads to is this notion that how can we make sure that in the face of these kind of attacks, both sort of cyber attacks which happen on these systems as well as attacks from the analog side, how can we make sure that these systems are still ones that we can trust? And as I had mentioned earlier, there are kind of two facets to it. There is a security aspect, and then there is kind of the privacy aspect that at least very broadly you can think along these terms. Who are the adversaries in these systems? So firstly, you have the remote third parties. So all the networked hackers who were compromising our regular systems are also compromising these systems. But your adversaries also include the manufacturer of these things, because they know that now you are going to be putting them into more private spaces. So they have all the reasons to collect data that they want. So there have always been these incidences that we discover, or this handset manufacturer was collecting some location data or stuff like that, which are examples where they are misusing the trust that you placed when you bought this device. You may also have issues where the owner of the thing or the operator of the thing violates the trust. So an example of this one is some of the news items in the past year or two where Airbnb hosts basically use webcams or microphones to spy on the guests that they have. So that would fall into this example where you are a visitor into that space, you have the reasonable expectation of privacy, but and then finally the occupants, as I mentioned, oftentimes since these sometimes we seek a service in return for a better deal, like either we are using it for free or at a lower cost, but in return we allow the service manufacturer to validate or verify that we are indeed doing it. But in that case, we have all the intent to fool it. So like, for example, if the insurance company is measuring how well I drive, do I speed, how much do I drive, or for example, electrical utilities often give lower rates if you agree not to use certain heavy appliances during certain times. So these are all cases where you may take the deal, but then you might want to fool the sensing system so that you can still benefit from the lower price and yet not obey the terms of the deal. So adversary to these systems could be any one of these, and that kind of so many different parties, like service provider may view the user as a potential adversary, and a user may view the manufacturer as a potential adversary, and so on and so forth. It's kind of a complicated milieu set of issues that come into play. Okay, so let's examine some of these. So what I've shown out here is kind of a generic network control system. So there are some physical systems out here. These could be, let's say, traffic light control in a city. Usually these physical systems would have some sensors and actuators. So it could be a sensor which is measuring, let's say, the cars which are stopped at different points on that intersection. Actuator is what controls the light. In a very typical scenario, after some local processing, the data from is sent over some sort of network to various controllers. and these controllers may interact with each other, may interact with other systems, and then sort of. And if you think in a system like this, where all attacks can happen, so firstly we just have the traditional network level attacks where I could modify packets, I could spoof packets, I could jam, I could delay the communication, all those kind of things that can happen. Things like modification and spoofing and jamming are also issues in normal computing, but things like delaying a packet have consequences which often are much more prominent in a control system, for example, where timing does matter. So I can attack the network. I can attack the nodes. So I could do by unauthorized access, I can then snoop, compromise, things like that. I could dislocate. So even a simple attack like something which is measuring some phenomenon, if I'm able to reorient it or displace it, I can have huge challenges there. Sybil attack. So Sybil is some sort of term from literature, but it basically refers to attacks which fake as you, okay, clones of you. Okay, so essentially by replicating so unprotected devices, maybe someone can copy its firmware and all and literally sort of clone a device, and now suddenly I have alternative versions who also have access to the network. So examples of these, for example, Waze. So as you know, Waze relies on reports from users about the traffic conditions. Some years ago, a group of grad students at Technion, what they did was they fooled the Waze system into thinking that there was traffic on a road when there wasn't, by essentially using a whole bunch of Android simulators or Android emulators, running Waze and feeding data into the Waze system. So as you know, there have been a lot of concerns about Waze directing traffic into neighborhoods. So sort of one reaction that people tried was to create these fake systems which would basically fool the system into Waze into thinking that there's already a lot of traffic out there, and then preventing additional actual cars being sent out there. In these kind of systems, I mean, again, of course, there's a cat and mouse game which kind of goes on. So you bring to bear a lot of additional knowledge and all. These are problems which are not simply of cryptography and whatnot. There's a lot more which has to go on there. Spoofing sensor signal, where instead of measuring the real physical state, we kind of spoof it, thinking a different view of the world. So by, for example, injecting, if it's a microphone, that for example, I can inject some other sound into it so that it thinks otherwise, thinks a different state. And then corrupting actuator signal. I can literally jam the actuator and thereby cause problems. So oftentimes the issue is that just the standard digital front door, so to say, is left wide open. So these systems, particularly industrial systems and building automation systems and all, are often controlled by kind of embedded devices which are then sort of controlled using what is called as SCADA software. And oftentimes these software and these systems have bugs, just like our regular computers do, and they become a target of attack. So many years ago, there was this famous or infamous, depending incident where US and Israel had penetrated into the Iranian centrifuge systems, a famous episode called Stuxnet. And in that case, those centrifuge, the uranium enrichment plants, they were using industrial controllers from Siemens, if I recall right, and because of as I'll describe later a little bit more, they're able to penetrate that system and essentially give the software an illusion that the centrifuges were running perfectly fine, even though they were spinning themselves to destruction. Holes in this software can have lots of consequences, or simply, so in that case it was damage, but in other cases it's simply causing other, just taking over the system. Okay, so to give you another example, another type of examples where we inject analog signals. So this is one out of University of Michigan that I was mentioning, where what they do is the following. They put electromagnetic interference, and if you look at the hardware, the way these sensors works, typically you would have some sort of a transducer, let's say a microphone. The signal gets amplified, then you digitize it, and then you feed it into some sort of a processor. So there is some portion out here where the weak analog signal is going over some sort of electrical trace. And if this is not properly shielded and designed, then this is where putting EMI, electromagnetic interference, compromise things further. So what these guys showed was that by properly injecting EM noise, they were able to affect what sound this guy was thinking that it was. And the laser example that I did is another variant of that, in which case they actually shine the laser on the microphone and make use of certain thermal effects. That's a more recent paper. This little video that I'm playing is actually an example from one of the Mission Impossible movies, where they penetrated the Kremlin and they're trying to fool the cameras, and again they kind of make use of essentially feeding in cameras a different view than what the reality is. I think in many Hollywood movies you have seen scenarios where the cameras get fooled. Sometimes it is by playing the same loop again, and I think in some James Bond movies also the same scenario. This one out here is an example of analog signal injection, which is to give to fool the GPS receivers. So in this case, you can, while it is a felony, but if you are so inclined, you can buy GPS spoofers from eBay and for fairly cheaply, or you can even construct your own. And then the idea is that you begin, your transmitter begins to spoof a GPS satellite. And the reason it is able to do it is because the civilian channels in GPS are not authenticated. So in the sense that you cannot, it's not that they are, they're not signed. So the satellites do not sign the signal they are sending on the civilian bands, and so anyone can pretend to be a satellite, and these are called beaconing attacks. And kind of the idea then is that you can fool the notion of location or fool the notion of time. So there are few examples of importance out here. So one is that smart grids use these sensors called PMUs. It stands for phasor measurement unit. And what basically these phasor measurement units do is they measure the phase of the AC signal, the voltage and the current. So the relative phase of voltage and current tells something about the load on the grid, and that's how they control the generation. To be able to do this, they have PMUs all over the grid. But these PMUs, which are distributed over, let's say, the western US, they need to be sampling very tightly synchronized, in the sense that for us to compare a reading here in LA versus a reading, let's say, out in Oxnard, let's say, okay, you need to be able to make sure they were taken at the same time, or you should know the precise shift between them. So the way they do it is they have GPS units out there, which are GPS, as you know, can provide tenths of nanosecond type time accuracy. So they timestamp and work with that. But if someone in that vicinity is able to spoof a GPS signal, then it will cause this PMU to think that the time is different, and then therefore the phase measurement is different, and therefore the grid control will get affected and you can crash the grid. Okay, so kind of the idea in particular is that at critical times, like when there is a terrorist incident happening or something, you can also crash these other infrastructures. So PMU is an example of that. In other systems, GPS is used for locationing and navigation. So again, if you can spoof the GPS, you could cause boat to veer or whatnot. The military version of GPS is not susceptible to this because there it does use cryptographically signed signals, which are not accessible to civilian GPSs, but the civilian one is. So again, one incident which exploited this, supposedly exploited this. So many years ago, there was an incident where American drone flying from Afghanistan landed in Iran and was captured by Iran. And the sort of explanation that emerged, and of course no one knows the true reality, is that the drone was using, it's a military drone, so it was using the military channels, but anything wireless can be jammed. So the theory goes that Iran in this case jammed the military frequencies, which caused the drone to revert to civilian frequencies, which they then spoofed to think that the drone was still in Afghanistan when it was actually in Iran and safely landed out there and was captured. What's the veracity of it? Don't know, but there are others. There are plenty of examples of these things. For example, I've also read, I have no personal validation of it, that if you are in Red Square area in Moscow, then actually the Russians spoof the GPS signal so that you think you are actually near the Moscow airport. Okay, maybe someone who's visited that can validate it sometime. There have been more public demonstration of this capability, with sort of deliberately organized. It's a known problem. There are defenses against this. So what we can't do at this point is go and make the civilian infrastructure very easily signed and all, because there are all sort of backward compatibility issues. So what has begun to happen is to design methods by which you can detect a spoofing attack is happening. So anytime a spoofer has to come in, it has to inject a signal. But there is also the valid satellite. So what the spoofers do is they gradually build up their signal until they reach the same level as the valid satellite, and then they start increasing the power and the receiver remains latched onto it. So while the valid satellite is still there, you kind of let the receiver, because it continues to track the strong signal, kind of track that. But intelligent radio receiver design and all can be robust against it. Another approach which people use is that now we have many other systems. You have the European Galileo system, you have the Russian and the Chinese systems. In some parts of the world you have other systems. You can sort of combine information from these with the hope that the adversary can't simultaneously won't simultaneously spoof all of them. So just okay. So these are all examples where analog signal injection plays a role. There are lots of examples of, let's see how we are doing in time. Okay, yeah, lots of examples in recent times on people showing attacks on sensors in the car, as I mentioned. So, for example, Mobileye is an Israeli company which I think got bought by Intel a couple of years ago. So the cameras that you see in cars, which are used for sort of purposes, lane keeping and stuff like that, people have shown it's like blinding attacks on these cameras. They play with, they shine by shining light and fooling the way these cameras react or do sort of AGC control or automatic gain control within that. They sort of attacking LiDARs to create illusions of objects. So LiDARs work by shining laser or rotating laser and looking at the scattering from the scene. And from that, what is called as point cloud, they construct what objects are out there. And it turns out that people have shown that we can inject signals into the LiDARs in effect to fool it into thinking objects which are. This is a piece of work which actually a former PhD student here did, and that was to fool the anti-lock braking systems. So what is ABS system? Anyone knows in cars? What does it do? Yeah. So what does it do?
Let the car not stop like immediately, like let the car stop like gradually.
Kind of. Okay. So the idea is the following: that if you just slam the brake, and if there is, let's say, snow or ice on the road, then your car will skid. Okay. So your wheel basically gets locked and this is skidding. So to prevent that, you're supposed to pump the brake. Except as humans, it's pretty hard for us to do that pumping, particularly in panic. So ABS systems basically look at the wheel speeds, and based upon that, they kind of control the braking thing in order to achieve that effect, so that even in more slippery conditions and all, you have a better control over it. So the way they work is there is a wheel sensor, and then of course there is a whole control system behind. There's a wheel speed sensor, and then there is a whole control system behind it, which then controls the brake. Now the way the wheel speed sensors work is common technology is the following: that they basically have a toothhead wheel, like a toothhead circular disc like this on the axle, and then there is a magnetic sensor which basically looks at how the magnetic field is being perturbed by this ferro basically iron disc. Okay, so we are basically measuring the perturbation in the variation in the magnetic field, right? So this thing is rotating. There is a magnetic, there is a sensor, and the magnetic field, there's a permanent magnet someplace nearby, and this field is therefore remodulated, and depending upon the rate at which the wheel is rotating, you basically get the speed, and then you feed it into the computers in the car, which are referred to as ECUs. And a whole bunch of them in the car for different purposes. So you feed it into the ECU that computes how the brake should be controlled. And we have these sensors on every wheel. So usually kind of idea is if one wheel locks up, then you would know, you would see a difference, the wheel speed and the wheel control things. So there's a kind of a high level detail. So what this student did was the following. He basically designed a malicious actuator. So essentially a tiny little circuit which injects a magnetic field out here so that the sensor gets fooled. And now the idea is we are able to give this thing illusion of any speed. Now the reason this thing works is that all this contraption is actually visible. You just go on with a car and this whole system is right out there. So even a valet or a parked car, you can just go and slip this thing in, making these things battery operated and all is very easy. And so kind of the idea now is that you can basically cause people to lose control at times that they shouldn't. So let's see if this thing works out. So in this case, so this is using an industrial simulator. So what you see is that this is a car encountered a ad and all that works fine. But in this case, in the second case, we are going to attack it and then the same control system, and what you see is that you lose control. Okay, so that's an example of how being able to non-invasively just manipulate the sensing signal. How can you prevent something like this? Any thoughts? So generally, if someone in the environment is messing with your ability to sense, in this case magnetic field out there, so let's take this particular one. What kind of things you could do to mitigate or cope with these kind of attacks? Pardon me? Okay, so redundant sensors of a different modality, one which the attacker cannot attack, but then I can just use that other sensor, right? Huh? Just cover the, yeah, make it harder to get to. So that's one part, yeah.
Could you correlate the magnetic data with some other kind of data, like GPS?
You could absolutely, although I guess the challenge in this particular case is that it's looking at very short regions. But as a general statement, what you are saying is right, that I can cross-check against different sources. Okay, so maybe not for this particular attack, but more generally, we certainly could. I guess a point which I wanted to bring out here is anytime you are doing passive sensing, where you are observing the world as is, then you are always going to be in principle susceptible to someone manipulating the signal you are receiving, right? I mean, because you are just listening, okay, and so you are going to capture whatever is coming. So it's not simply in this case the magnetic field, but it could also be, for example, a camera is being fooled about something that doesn't exist in the scene. So one way to cope with these kind of things is to revert to active sensing. And by active sensing, what I mean is, instead of just passively listening to the energy coming, some physical signal coming from the outside world, you shine energy onto the world and then look at how it is interacting with the world. Okay, so for example, in case of a camera, it could be a flashlight, right? I flash the light and then look at it, because it now gives you some control, because you can embed some signal, some additional information in this energy you are shining, which the adversary doesn't necessarily have to cope with it. So in case of cameras, I have seen people encode into the flash, kind of like essentially you're capturing the scene, but what you do is you have a flashing light. It could be flashing infrared or something, but which is injecting a pattern into the scene, and the adversary cannot react to it because it doesn't know. You have certain randomness in the energy you are kind of putting out. So active sensing combined with embedding in that energy. The solution to this particular one that this student had done was kind of similar in nature, which is he basically introduced an electromagnet which he controlled, which essentially the sensor injected a magnetic field and it looked at its interaction. So instead of a passive magnet, the way in these systems are, you basically have a magnet which is whose magnetic field is controlled by the sensor itself. So active sensing tends to be a key. The final bit I wanted to do before we wrap up for today is this class of attacks which are even able to compromise more sophisticated things which are going on. So in this previous example, we injected false input, but the false input was almost very trivially defined, like we changed the magnetic field and the rest. We were not assuming any high degree of sophistication on the back end. But then we have these other sensors which take this analog signal and then they subject it to all sort of machine learning models and stuff like that to do things like extract what was being said and then act upon it. So all our digital assistants are of that nature, that they start out with kind of this analog waveform and then extract features and subject them into a neural network model and or some other model, feed them into a natural language model, and then eventually kind of extract something out of that. So lot of work has emerged in recent years on fooling these systems, and there are a variety of approaches which have been taken. So one approach is hidden voice commands, and kind of the idea is that we can hide into the regular signal, some sort of embed in it, perhaps a lower energy valid audio signal. So still in the audio spectrum, but the system kind of reacts to it. So hidden voice command. So it could be like a TV advertisement blaring, and in it is some command which is then interpreted by your digital assistant. Another one is inaudible voice commands, where it turns out that the microphones that exist in these systems, they not only listen to the audible range, but they are also sensitive to ultrasound range. And so the idea is that by putting energy in the ultrasound range so that the humans don't hear, but the system will still kind of react to it. So, so the goal in all these cases is kind of the following, that we want the device to react, but a human nearby will still think nothing was wrong. Okay, so that's what's happening out here. And then a final one are adversarial voice commands, where kind of the idea is that we manipulate, we put some very low, we add some noise to the signal, but the noise is designed such a manner that the same signal, if one person hears, if a human hears, may hear a yes, and if the machine hears it, it will interpret it as a no. So kind of the idea is that we want to design these attacks where I have two sensors, a human and the real sensor. Human interprets it one way, so if it's an image, human thinks it's a cat, but the machine thinks it's a dog, even though every human will think it's a cat. So these are called as adversarial inputs, and in case of sound, they take this form, that there is a sound clip which most humans, or all, hopefully, will hear it one way, but these common ML models will hear the other way. So I'm going to stop out here, and we are going to pick this thread up on Thursday.